Again, welcome. It's the last of our 4 series, and I'm hoping to arrange next 4 Tuesdays with some Mel Brooks films. I think it's a good change, which we could use. So we'll figure out technically how we can all watch the Mel Brooks together, invite the rest of the community in on it, and see if we can have a sort of a pre-showing and a post-Zoom discussion if it's necessary. Hi, everybody. See Mel. Good to see you, Mel. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So we've been talking about people who you may not know a lot about. Perhaps you knew about Hannah Arendt, who was quite important thinker. We talked about Franz Rosenzweig, which most people at one time had heard about, but most people have forgotten. And then Eugene Borowitz, who sort of is the impetus for the changes in the reform movement. Very important theologian in that sense. We're going to talk about Arthur A. Cohen, Arthur Allen Cohen. There were really 5 different Arthur Cohens, okay? And nearly all of them had, in their way, a cult following, and I was one of the cult, okay, followers. And you have basically, you have him as would call him a neo-traditional thinker. Some have said a neo-Orthodox theologian, but I wouldn't go that far. Certainly maybe Orthodox, but certainly not Orthoprax. There's there's Cohen, who was an astonishingly successful book publisher. He was one of the people who heralded the paperback revolution. And he had a very important press, Ex Libris, and a few others that were very successful. He was a organizer of salons in his home, bringing together all kinds of intellectuals together. And he also was able to gather quite a bit of things in a remarkable anthology, 20th Century Religious Thought, which is a remarkable volume, A to Z, with some of the leading thinkers in the world doing topics from A to Z, and I'm proud that I got 2 little pieces in it, a little bit of posterity in that volume, which has been reprinted a number of times. And he also was a novelist and a storyteller. He was a challenging and perhaps for us also important, one of the first, if you will, post-Holocaust theologians, and we'll talk about that as well. So he also had a variegated life. He was an art collector, and he was really so many different things in a very short life. And he died at the age of 58 back in the 1980s. So what I'd like to do is, I'm indebted to 2 scholars who have informed me about him, 2 scholars and colleagues. David Stern, who's at Harvard now, and Paul Mendes-Flohr, who was at the Hebrew University and the University of Chicago, an old friend for many years. And they put together a thing called the Arthur Cohen Reader. There's only a few copies left on Amazon. It's out of print, but it puts together a lot of the different things that we're going to be talking about in one volume. He was as you get my gist, he was very versatile. And more and more as the years go on, it often is the case, people are beginning to take him in again and to see him as an important contributor. So one of the important things is that he based himself to begin with on the people that we have talked about earlier, particularly Franz Rosenzweig, and he built upon that. And I'll give you a little bit of a biography. It's important to know where he came from. He was born into an affluent and assimilated family in New York City. His formative intellectual experiences came during the 1940s at the University of Chicago. At this eminently scholarly institution, he found himself drawn to the classics of Christian theology and devotion, from St. Augustine to St. Anselm, to the sermons of Meister Eckhart. If you don't know Meister Eckhart, he was a medieval Christian mystic. And he said basically that by early days, I'm quoting, of University of Chicago days, had brought forth full-blown and this is an interesting term, a quasi-skeptical neurasthenia, not at all unusual in American Jewish life. Simple, I found Judaism unattractive, Christianity more attractive. And as with Franz Rosenzweig that we talked about, who dramatically recommitted himself to Judaism after that Yom Kippur event in a small synagogue in Berlin, so too, Cohen's story is one of return. And like Rosenzweig, Cohen returned and he tried to reformulate and the retrieval that he was making of his Jewish past and Jewish sources. And he would incorporate, rather than deny, his early experiences and exposure with Christianity. That's one of the books that he wrote that I recommend is called The Judeo-Christian Myth. He thinks that that was something invented for somehow to create some sense of a Jew to fit into American society. But he really saw that there was a distinct distinction between Judaism and Christianity that you really couldn't call a Jewish, a Judeo-Christian ideology. So Cohen's theology of Judaism would always, to some extent, be predicated upon the existence of Christianity. He does deny it as a promise and a reality to be denied by the Jew. To be a Jew ultimately is to deny Christianity. But in rejecting Christianity, Cohen came to emphasize in Judaism that which Christianity denied, that the world still awaits its Redeemer. Of course, Christianity believes the redemption had come, but of course, for Jews, the Redeemer has yet to come. And the catalyst for Cohen's renewed attachment to Judaism was a gentleman who we didn't get a chance to talk about, but you may know the name. His name is Milton Steinberg. He was the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, a leading conservative rabbi, who wrote two books that you may be aware of. One was called Basic Judaism, which is a very thin little volume for people interested in getting to know Judaism. And then he's most well known for a novel that he wrote called As a Driven Leaf. Some of you may have heard of that, As a Driven Leaf, which talks about the four who entered into Pardes, Rabbi Akiva, Elisha ben Abuya, Ben Zoma, and Ben Azai. And he talks about what it was that they got involved in the first and second centuries of the Common Era. So Milton Steinberg really was the one who took him on as a student, became his teacher, and he was considered one of the distinguished religious thinkers of his time. And it was to him, rather than to a psychoanalyst, that Cohen's parents sent him in 1945 when he was contemplating rejecting Judaism and accepting Christianity. So they sent him to their Rabbi Steinberg. And what Rabbi Steinberg did was give him a course in basic Judaism, which he had not gotten. And he met with him on a regular basis, and he gave him this encouragement to study Hebrew and urged him to spend time in what was then, before 1948, it was Palestine, and giving him as a parting gift a set of tefillin. Now, the latter would play a rather limited role in Cohen's life, with the exception of a brief period that he had of Jewish observance, religious observance, in spite of his deep respect of halakha. Cohen was almost entirely unobservant. So he was an antinomian. He was nomian, but a non-observant nomian, if you use that term. By the way, we used to have in New York years ago, many of you are from the New York area, probably had it in Chicago too. You had people who were unobservant Orthodox Jews. You familiar with them? Right? When anything had to happen in the life cycle, it always had to be Orthodox. They couldn't be conservative reform. However, they were themselves not observant, but they belonged either to an Orthodox shul they didn't go to, which was important to have a shul you don't go to, and but when things were important, marriages, et cetera, you always asked for an Orthodox rabbi. And his influence, Steinberg's influence on Cohen was very, very deep and continued throughout his life. And he then decided to study for a while at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he picked up his connection with texts. And Then he joined forces with a friend named Cecil Hemley to found the Noonday Press. A few years later, he founded a subsidiary press called Meridian. These are names that you might recall from your early years. And the list of distinguished writers published in these presses include Ortega y Gasset, Machado de Assis, Shalom Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Cohen was one of the first to introduce the American audiences to these translations of these great thinkers. And during this period, he also began publishing the fruits of his theological reflections, eventually publishing in 1962 a very important book called The Natural and the Supernatural Jew. The Natural and the Supernatural Jew. And being drawn to the European existentialism, particularly the work of Buber and Rosenzweig, we have mentioned, Cohen can be grouped with a number of post-Holocaust, post-war Jewish theologians, including Eugene Borowitz that we mentioned, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and another thinker named Will Herberg. I don't know if you ever heard the name. Will Herberg wrote a very important book at the beginning of the 1950s called Protestant Catholic Jew. And it was basically his book that created this mythology of the fact that in order to be a good citizen of this beautiful country, you had to either be a Protestant Catholic or a Jew. Now, I think he got Jew worked well because it was only 3 letters, very short. You didn't have to have a one. If it was Rastafarians, we never would have made it. But at this time, he's really involved in thinking about why he has returned to Judaism. And in Harper's Magazine in 1959, he wrote an essay, Why I Choose to Be a Jew. And in that essay, Cohen issues a declaration of faith in which the operative concept, and this is something I want you to get across, very important, the operative concept is personal decision. So he was saying ultimately, as we now, of course, accept many, many years later, that every Jew is a Jew by choice. Every Jew is a Jew by choice. Every Jew, in a sense, has to, quote unquote, convert to Judaism sometime in their lives to make it a choice rather than only an ethnic connection. And then he says, quote, I have decided to embrace Judaism, he wrote, and I have not done so out of loyalty to the Jewish people or the Jewish state. My choice was religious. I chose to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to acknowledge the law of Moses as the word of God, to accept the people of Israel as a holy instrument of divine fulfillment, to await the coming of the Messiah and the redemption of history. So in that framework in 1959, he's saying what he embraces is the basic religious doctrines of Judaism rather than Jewish nationalism or loyalty to the Jewish people. So a statement like this is really quite working in the face of what was going on in the 1950s in the United States, particularly with success of Mordechai Kaplan. I know there are people here who will want me to spend more time on Kaplan. He deserves 4 lectures by himself. Matter of fact, there's a book that I've been reading over the last weeks, which is it's called If Not Now, When? And it's basically an entire book of conversations between Arthur Cohen and Mordechai Kaplan. So they really were in a constant kind of conversation, and he was basically trying to overcome Kaplan's, if you will, extreme nationalism, rationalism and naturalism. I remember meeting Kaplan towards the end of his life when he was living in Jerusalem. He used to go out every morning on a spazier, very well dressed. He had a cane at that time. He lived to be 101 or so. So he must have been 85 or 90 when I met him. And people would lob on to him as he walked, and I did it as a young chutzpah student at the Hebrew University, and he would put his arm into your arm to steady himself, and you would start a conversation. You would leave, someone else would lob on, another conversation, and he never changed his mind. He said, my boy, the answer for everything, the answer of it all is science. Science is the answer, a total rationalist, and he never changed his mind about it. And Kaplan had dominated, really, Jewish life in the 40s and certainly into the 50s. And Cohen's list of beliefs, if you will, his ani ma'amin, I believe, resembles a bit the 13 attributes that Rambam, Maimonides, stressed, but there were differences. And the differences, whereas Rambam would say, being orthodox, if you will, that God knows every deed of men and all their thoughts. He rewards those who keep the mitzvot and punishes those who transgress the mitzvot. Whether he said the ani ma'amin in order to save his reputation is unclear. Right? There's the whole argument about Maimonides writing deceptively. He was writing in a way to satisfy his orthodox, if you will, critics, and also to appeal to the young Jews who were becoming interested in philosophy. By contrast, Cohen's God appears to await a human agent who takes it upon him or herself to choose God. So a Jew by choice not only chooses to be a Jew by religion, but he chooses God. He chooses God. And that's why I like, rather than saying the chosen people, I like that we can say that we are the choosing people. The choosing people. And that's really an important thing. Now, all of Cohen's theological writings circulate around these two figures and two types that I talked about, which he represented in his book, The Natural and the Supernatural Jew. The first one, the natural Jew, and the second is the supernatural Jew. So the natural Jew is, he writes, and I'm quoting, a creature situated in nature and activated by history. He is shaped by the multiple influences of the external world, his family, his historical moment, his language, his national culture. He confronts the world with its numerous contingencies as a finality, an inescapable fate. That's the natural Jew, right? This is where we are. This is how we relate to the world. This is the world we live in, and we have to adjust to that way. That's a natural phenomenon. However, the supernatural Jew, by contrast, lives with a constant recognition that, and this is a term that he uses, wonderful, I like it because it really translates the word revelation beautifully. He says, God has opened himself to the Jewish people, offering his covenant with them as proof that nature and secular history are not absolute, that they can be transcended. By opening himself to God in response to God's covenant, the supernatural Jew can live out a Jew's destiny. And fate and destiny, by the way, F-A-T-E, fate and destiny are two things that will come up later in the 1960s and 70s in the work of Rav Soloveitchik. We won't get into that now, but that's another thinker that probably a lot of you have not thought of, but a very important, potent thinker in the last 50 years. So the distinction between fate and destiny is crucial for Cohen. And I quote, if the Jew exercises his freedom to intend transcendence, he is able to break out of fate into destiny, break out of faith into destiny. I'm just trying to check my volume if it's high enough. How's that? A little bit better? Okay. Oops. Let me back in. Okay. So that's important, that this idea of the transcendent is possible. And we can, in a sense, transcend. He's not saying change your fate. You're not going to be able to change the exigencies of your life. Those are there. They're real. They're natural. However, with the capacity to transcend them, we have become a people that has gone beyond the historical, and like Rosenzweig, we have remained ahistorical. Somehow we have not conformed to the laws of history. We have not conformed to the fate of other peoples. We are still here, right? Where are the Hittites? Where are the Jebusites, etc.? All of those wonderful empires are no longer with us, but we are there. So if to break into destiny means for Cohen to orient oneself
Moshe, can I ask you a question?
Excuse me?
This is Mel. Can I ask you a question?
No, you can't. You have to wait till I finish, and then I open the question. You can mute yourself.
That's fine. I'll remute.
Okay, thank you. This is the way we've been doing it for a while, so it's we're keeping up that thing. Otherwise, it winds up I can't say what I want. So, okay. So to break into destiny, it's a great term. He says, and I quote, to orient oneself around the possibility of redemption. Another distinction that Cohen insists on, and one that suggests a political dimension to his thought, is the distinction between dispersion and diaspora. And that became an interesting little argument. At what point do you stop saying that Yidden wohnen in Golus, that Jews live in exile and thus are unredeemed? And then when the state of Israel developed the need to extend themselves to Jews in Golus, and they had to get away from this idea that the Galut is a negative and Israel is a positive, it became no longer the Golus, it became the diaspora, Jews in the diaspora, which was just basically an identifying term without a value judgment. So the exile, the diaspora traditionally was seen as a divine judgment, right? There was some reason to be dispersed, and the world cannot be undone by actions that human beings initiate. So traditional orthodoxy, traditional Judaism was very wary of people who tried to rush the end of days, particularly the Zionists, for instance, right, who overthrew tradition in order wanted to create a state. So he says the exile is the historical coefficient of being unredeemed. However, Cohen calls upon Jews to recognize that they occupy what he calls a sufficient site, if you will, a between sphere, a position between the solidities, if you will, of the finalities of the beginning and the end. We're in the middle. We are a constructive reality because it signals the beginning of redemption as much as it marks the end of a pristine and ancient homogeneity. From these basic tenets, basically Cohen sets out to address what is plaguing American Jewish life. And he calls it, and again, it's the term that I don't truly understand entirely, quasi-skeptical neurasthenia. There must be a psychologist or psychiatrist in the group who can explain that. But there's a certain kind of split in the Jewish personality because we live in this in-betweenness. I think that's the word, in-betweenness. I think many of us can attest to that. That we're caught somehow in this in-between thing. So the underlying problem with contemporary Judaism, Cohen insists, is that the Jewish mind, and this I use all the time, he influenced me a great deal in this, is that we've lost the capacity to mythologize. We've become demythologized. Mythology, of course, doesn't mean a myth. Mythology means the creation of a cultural and, if you will, spiritual framework, which within you work, okay, within you live. And he thinks that this is one of the things about the post-Enlightenment period in Europe was that the Jews, I'll quote, post-Enlightenment Jews have forgotten the essence of the Jewish vocation. More precisely, they have translated the religiously significant paradigms of Jewish life into secular concepts. He continues, the Jewish mind as a natural and empirical phenomenon, I'll go over that again, the Jewish mind as a natural and empirical phenomenon is an absurdity. It consists in but pale images, P-A-L-E, images of theological models of prophetism and messianism transformed into social and political ideologies. Exile, recast, and this is something he had a lot of fights with the intellectuals of his own day. He says, exile is now being recast in a secular sense as social alienation, loneliness, a spirit of discomfort. And this became, if you will, a pale image of what it meant to be in exile. To say self-alienation became sort of so self-centered and became sort of, if you will, even a bit of a stereotype, right? Jews are self-alienated, they're self-hating, they're self-deprecating. This became very popular in the 1950s and certainly with some of the, in the 1960s as well. So eventually we can get it down to this, and then I'll give a chance for us to talk a little bit. Every human event, he writes, has two sides. The side turned towards the quotidian and familiar, quotidian meaning the everyday, and familiar. The regular and the ordained. The side which is turned toward freedom and invention. As a declaration of faith, this statement does not seek renewal in any of the traditional gauges of Jewish life, such as Torah study and halachic observance. Rather, the essence of Judaism. The parable underscores the possibility of spiritual rebirth, even under extraordinary duress. And this theme of the Holocaust, which first makes his impress in Cohen's fiction, gradually moved to the fore in his work from the 1970s onward. And it led up to a book that I recommend. It's very hard to get a hold of it anymore, called The Tremendum. The Tremendum, which is his response to the Shoah theologically. So in a talk that he gave in the Leo Beck Institute in 1974, this idea was the form, his claim was that the Holocaust represents the unprecedented manifestation of absolute evil. As such, it fundamentally alters the terms of God's relationship to the Jewish people. Unlike the destructions of the temple, which we'll be commemorating on tomorrow night, Tisha B'Av, unlike the destruction of the temples or the expulsion from Spain, the Holocaust cannot be explained in any way as divine retribution. And traditional Jewish theodicy means justification of God, theodicy, cannot suffice. And what you have in their place now is a recognition that normal time can open into the abyss. We can fall into an abyss, a dimension in which intelligible causality is interrupted and the providence of God gives way, and he calls this the tremendum. And he's playing on, of course, the work of a person I mentioned to you a number of times, Rudolf Otto, who in 1914 wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy. And there, Otto contends that God's presence manifests itself to humans as a mysterium tremendum, an unfathomable or terrifying mystery. And by contrast, Cohen identifies the Shoah as a manifestation of sheer terror without the accompanying mystery of God's presence. And Cohen proposes that Jews must be instructed to, as we do with the Passover story, and we read at the Seder table, the Haggadah, that it would be really important also to assert to a contemporary Jews an obligation to hear the witness of the Shoah as though they were also witnesses. Remember, one of the things we say at the Seder, a very interesting existential demand. Every person should see himself as if he was liberated from Egypt. So if the Shoah is such an abyss and such a caesura, a break, shouldn't there be some way for us to say every Jew should see himself as if he was in Auschwitz? It's a very tough concept for us, right? We would say, oh, no, we shouldn't have that. On the other hand, I think I understand what he's saying, because without accepting and seeing the Shoah, he says, as this example of of sheer and utter evil, without acknowledging that, without somehow imbibing that, intensifying and internalizing it, it could be, and it is already, it could be something that fades away. Whereas this message of the Haggadah has not faded away for thousands of years. Because I ask myself that question all the time. Is there a way that we can keep the memory of the Shoah alive if we don't institutionalize it somehow, ritually? And I think Yom HaShoah is enough, to be honest, because it doesn't deal with that capacity for future generations. We'll never know a survivor, never know a child of a survivor, never know 150, 200 years from now. What is it that we can do? And this is what Cohen is considering, that we should create something that allows us to internalize it so it becomes part of that experience of remembering that is so important for the Jewish people. So I'm going to move along a little bit and just get to a number of things that I think are going to be helpful to us. He wrote a very interesting novel, which I recommend to you if you can get a hold of it. His longest and most celebrated work, and the one where the legend of the last Jew comes from, is a book called In the Days of Simon Stern. It was published in 1973, and it was one of the early entries in this new kind of fiction that was beginning to emerge as Holocaust fiction. Written from the perspective of a blind, oracular narrator named Nathan, it recounts the emergence of the Messiah during the 1940s in New York. When the messianic figure Simon Stern receives news of the death camps, he determines that now is the time to begin the work of redemption. So he travels to Europe and he retrieves a group of Holocaust survivors who he houses at a version of Solomon's temple that he builds on the Lower East Side. This is the novel, right? And the Messianic project self-destructs. But as the novel's narrator assures us, the Messiah himself has escaped and is presently at large in the world. So the novel is at once playful and profoundly serious in its declaration of faith in Judaism's redemptive mission. And one of the major running themes concerns the difference between the genre of Greek tragedy with its doctrine of fate and the messianic epic with its insistence that human history remains open to an incursion from the divine. Now, this is based, I guess, as you know, on a number of Jewish sources, mostly in Agadah, in Jewish, if you will, Agadah, I would call the lore, L-O-R-E, rather than the halakha lore, which says the Messiah is born every day. Or, even more starkly, it says that each of us can be that Messiah. So every child that's born can be the Messiah. So this idea that the Messiah is at large, or if you want to say he's on the most wanted list, he's on the most wanted list. And people have been seeking this, and hopefully they will find it. So I'm going to just move ahead and get to one more thing. So this multiple and this very varied person, it really challenges us. And he says, and I'll quote again, for Cohen, the Holocaust represents a challenge to traditional conceptions of the Jewish God, but a challenge that can be met. And he goes on and says, the God of Israel is worth the undertaking, and the time is now to build again upon the wreckage of previous understandings. And when he describes his project of building again, Cohen emphasizes that a new understanding of God will differ from the old, specifically with reference to divine power. God describes a God with limited control over the world. The God who will endure, he writes, may well prove to be less, the term that he uses is a term called imperious, a little bit less imperious. Imperious means, if you will, how should I say, controlling, okay? Imperious, controlling, and authoritarian. But may gain in credibility and truth what he has lost in unconditional absoluteness. So as we began, I'll end. Once again, the challenge for all of our existentialist thinkers, the challenge is posed to individuals, not to God. Wherever one stands with respect to Cohen's assertions and overall program, it is really important to realize that what he's asking of us is that individually we take a step. And it's a step, if you will, if you want to call it a step of faith, that's fine. But more important, as I mentioned last time to you, it is the possibility of expanding again the Jewish imagination. Those of you who heard my talk on, I'm sorry, the sound was very bad on Shabbos tape, the Shabbos recording. I talked last week was with the Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat of visioning. I talked about how the imagination gives us the capacity to vision. And once we have vision, we have the capacity to actually overcome what stops us, overcome the obstacles that we find in front of us. So it reminds us that the work of the imagination is the great challenge facing Jewish writing, and it is there, of course, because imagination can indeed renew our faith and reorient our lives around the possibility of redemption. Take a breath and a drink, and Mel, you got it. You can start. Unmute yourself.
Well, the question I had at the beginning, I mean, it runs throughout. Did he have, for lack of a better word, a religious experience, or was this all a intellectual exercise that led him to where he ended up?
Yes.
Both.
Yes. That's right. He came through it, I think, essentially by assessing Christianity and realizing, as many Jews do, that's why he says the Jew has to deny Christianity, because Christianity puts a mediator between us and God. And any mediation for us is considered to be a transgression of the essence of the covenant, that it's made between us and God. It's not made between an individual. We don't do it with Moses, for instance. Moses doesn't become an intermediary in the sense that Jesus becomes an intermediary. Moses certainly doesn't replace God. The Torah goes so far as saying we don't even know where Moses is laid to rest, because we don't want that place to become a shrine where people will say, "Oh, holy Moses," right? So yeah, I think that's what did it intellectually, but I think it also did it spiritually, because he wanted that connection. He wanted that connection.
Well, because
anyone else? Yes, Michael Goldberg, unmute yourself.
Did he have, hi Reb Moshe, did he have a formula or a suggested path for how one makes that connection with God? Was he, it sounded like you said that he was in some, not orthoprax, but orthodox. Was he suggesting that traditional ritual was that way to reconnect with God, or was it something less clear?
I think in one way he would say, yes, that's the way to do it. He couldn't do it. For whatever reason, he couldn't do it. But he had a deep sense that it was religious practice that allowed people to do it. Now, of course, like all of our tradition, we hope that that practice does not become rote and unthinking and lacking in kavanah, lacking in the capacity of giving us that transcendent moment. You see, when we say a bracha, what's happening? What's happening? You say a bracha over a peach. You are invoking a transcendence over that natural thing, which is a peach. And what are you saying? It's part of the universe. It's part of creation. You're developing a transcendent kind of feeling about this everyday mundane thing. And that's what transcendence allows us. that capacity to go beyond just the natural reality that we all face. And I think that's how you get away from fate, as he says, and into destiny. Breaking into destiny. It's a great term. Great term. Anyone else like to ask something or comment? Who else has a hand up? Ken, please. Unmute yourself, Ken. On the bottom of your screen. Good. Yeah. Are we hearing Ken? I'm not hearing Ken. Are you having a little trouble with the Zoom? You want to do it in the sign language? I don't read sign language, so I can't do it. No, Ken, can you try to do it again? Okay, when you figure it out, I'll come back to you. Who else wanted to say something? I see some hands up, some hands up. Yes, Jack, how are you, Jack? Jack, unmute yourself.
Good seeing
How you doing, Yanko? Yanko, how you doing? Good? Yanko's doing good, all right.
So, what was his relationship with Israel, and not only its founding, but as it developed?
He was a supporter of Israel the way we are. He lived in the United States. So, you know, it matters how you define what a Zionist is, right? Ben Gurion once said, pack your bag and take a plane, you become a Zionist. You know where you can go. But he was, like us, a strong supporter of Israel. Remember, he died at a time when Israel was still, very positively seen in the world. But he also saw the importance of diaspora. And you know that's the bipolar idea. You know the bipolar idea. There shouldn't be one pole around which it's an ellipsis. Okay, you know what I mean? It's an ellipse. And one of the best works on this is a work called Pavel V'Yerushalayim. It's a wonderful work by Simon Ravidovich about the fact that without Palestine, you needed Babylonia, right? And our sources that we study, Talmud, all that, would not be possible if we had relied only on Palestine. You had to have Babylonia. And as a matter of fact, some of the great scholars who came to Eretz Israel came from Babel, including Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the Elder, came from Babylonia to deal with solving a problem that they couldn't solve in Palestine. It's interesting. So, yes, he believed in a bipolar, which I do as well. Like, we have to have a strong diaspora, a strong Israel, and ultimately there has to be a healthy interchange between the two. Yes, Jill, unmute yourself.
Reb Moshe, I'm very interested in the fact that he couldn't find a spiritual place within practice, and
Yeah, it was hard for him for some reason. Yeah, it was, as he said, he got the tefillin as his last gift from Rabbi Steinberg, and he may have responded like Rosenzweig responded when he asked about mitzvot. If you recall, he would say, "Are you laying tefillin?" And he would say, "Not yet."
Well, I was just curious about it because what was his way to reach his connection with God? I mean, a lot of us do it through prayer, through meditation, through song, through.
He did it through writing. He did it through writing. He did it through intellectual discourse. He did it through the theology. I mean, he was totally immersed in a Judaism that had God at the center.
But also, you were saying that his Judaism did not come from his connection to the Jewish people.
His family was in a assimilated, rich New York Jewish family. So whether they went to the holidays, I don't know. But he didn't know much.
So but my question is, what bound him to other Jews? What besides was his?
I think his name Cohen was a giveaway. for many PE people.
No, but I mean spiritually. I mean, what bound him? I mean, obviously.
I think what it did was his study of Christianity and his inability to find in Christianity what he needed. So his parents sent him to Rabbi Steinberg and said, "Oh, I hope he doesn't convert, God forbid." Right? So Rabbi Steinberg showed him the beauty of Judaism, and he got immersed and became a really serious student of Judaism, and that's how he connected through Steinberg and through the seminary and his ongoing study throughout his life. So,
Right. So it's not about peoplehood. It's about his relationship.
Right. It wasn't peoplehood. It was this thing about how do you become the human agency for God. Now, for us, we've been teaching this for a long time. At that time, it was not as clear because it was a very rationalist period of time, the 1950s and the early 60s, when it came to Jewish thinking and Jewish theology. No one was talking mysticism then at all. That's really a phenomenon of 25 to 30 years. Before that, no one talked about this kind of stuff. Maybe you could interpret Abraham Joshua Heschel of having within his teaching some mystical concepts, but it was not there, that kind of connection. It was much more. His idea of supernaturalism. He needed to have this idea that all of us have these two sides, and if we only emphasize one side, we miss the boat. I think that's what he was basically saying, and I think for him to say that, in the post-Holocaust period was quite remarkable. I mean, scholars have followed him. Irving Greenberg, for instance, and others also believe that in a sense, the covenant was shattered by the Shoah, and a new covenant has to be built up. But again, Greenberg, perhaps relying on Cohen, I'm sure he's read Cohen's stuff, Greenberg too says it has to happen with a deep pluralism, that each Jew will take on how he or she sees that path back to God, and there isn't a right or wrong path. So there's no right for any one group to put down another group and say, you're not authentic. Because there's no more authenticity except you're, in a sense, why should anybody remain Jewish after the Shoah? It's sort of dangerous to be Jewish, isn't it? They kill you. So he says, let 1,000 flowers bloom. If there's somebody who wants to have a Judaism that men and women are equal, gesundheit, it's not for me to tell them, oh, that's not right. Another Judaism wants to ordain gay rabbis. Gesundheit. I'm so glad they want to be rabbis. That's real pluralism, by the way. So we talked about that earlier, the difference between pluralism and tolerance. It's not enough to be tolerated. I don't want to be, oh, it's so nice of you to tolerate me, even though I'm a little bit off the path. Right? But I want to say, no, I have a path. And whatever path that is, if it is committed to bolstering Jewish continuity, that's a true path. And that's not a lot of Jewish thinkers have that attitude, particularly in certain Orthodox circles. Do not see that as necessarily a value to be non-judgmental. Matter of fact, many of us don't see it as a value to be non-judgmental because we are, for the most part, very judgmental. Yes, who else is on who'd like to say a word or two?
Moshe, I'm back.
Is that Ken? You're back.
Yeah.
Yay!
So here's the question for you. Did Arthur Cohen have a different view of God prior to the Shoah? In other words, a view of God in which God was all controlling, and the Shoah more or less shattered that view for him, much like it did for many other Jews. But rather than saying, God failed us, or where was God, he basically said, well, God was never really that, never had that kind of omniscient power. He really had less of a power over what we do.
Right. His personal chronology makes that not a possible question, because he was not involved in any of this stuff at the University of Chicago before 1940. He was not. He delved into traditional theology, but he himself had no quote unquote theological stance. He was a young person, and he only graduated University of Chicago in 1945. So from 1941 to 45 is when he's starting to get these ideas. Before that, he's 16 years old or 17 years old. I don't think he had a very sophisticated and built-up theological, construct. However, as he got more and more involved in studying theology, he realized that in traditional theologies, in Jewish theology, that was the idea, as I quoted, the Maimonidean idea. Every thought, everything is already known to God, and God is so powerful. So he didn't have anything pre to that. He did, however, get totally, if you will, changed by his encounters at the University of Chicago, and then after that, with his return to Judaism, and from a very early time, starting to confront what the Shoah meant. Now remember, it took a long time. It took a long time before we could confront it in any way. Elie Wiesel's book, Night, wasn't published till 1961, 16 years. And that was considered to be a breakthrough. The Eichmann trial, etc., had less interest in the theological. The Eichmann trial had a lot of interest in the historical, recording what happened, and etc. So he was one of the early people to really try to deal seriously in a theological way with the Shoah. And many people based themselves upon him over the years. Anyone else? Lily, unmute.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the story the fable you wanted us to read.
Yeah.
Which I read.
Well, if you read the fable, it's a very stirring fable.
Yes.
I don't want to give it away for those who haven't read it, because the ending for me it's sublime.
Well, I want to talk about the ending. That's what I want to talk about.
I know, but I can't talk about the ending without being a spoiler. I don't want to spoil it. So I'd like you to read it, and maybe at another opportunity we'll get a chance to talk about it. But I think it's unfair to give the end up.
How many people read it?
But you do agree that would be bad to give that away. How many people read it? You have 4 or 5?
How many people read it?
I have 1, 2,
Read
3,
4 pages.
4. You read 4 pages, so you haven't read it yet. So we have 4 people, and the rest haven't. So it's like giving away the end of a good novel.
Well, I do think it needs to be discussed. That's what I'm trying to say.
Moshe,
Yes, of course, it needs to be discussed. But we'll find an opportunity. Yeah.
I tried.
Diane, I think Diane was saying something.
No, I tried getting on to read it and I couldn't get it. It kept spinning.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what that is about. I can't tell you. I'm technologically.
So is there another way? It's okay. Is there another way to find it?
If you put your email
I
in the
found
chat,
it online. I found it online, and
I'll
you can
email
try to
it to
look
you.
for it. The legend. I think it's called The Fable or The Legend of the Last Jew. I forgot the last.
It's
Try to
called
find it
The
online,
Last Jew on
because-
Earth, a fable.
The Last Jew on Earth, a Fable.
Fable.
So take a look, and you might be able to find it.
Yeah. I'll
Diane, I
email it
see-
around,
Um,
Moshe.
What? Say it again, Gary.
If you put your name in your email address in the chat, I'll email it to you right now.
I'm putting it in right now.
Barbara,
Thank
put
you.
your email in the chat, and Gary will send you his right now.
Okay.
Okay, go to the chat and put in your.
Okay, what I wanted is someone to put the answer in the chat.
Don't put the answer in the chat. Please don't give it away. Don't give it away. Hold yourself back. Have a little bit of a bisschen geduld, a little patience. Diane, please, you've been very nice.
I have to go on to another lecture in 3 minutes, so I have to cut out at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Just really quick, I heard David Stern at Harvard, a wonderful historian, did a lot on books and manuscripts, talk about the fact that Cohen loved profoundly early and ancient Jewish texts, and he also had a business around the buying and selling of Jewish manuscripts or Jewish texts. And I just wondered where that piece of his life as a commercial person kind of intersected with his spiritual life, because it felt, from what Cohen said, what David Stern said, that
Stern was a
his
protege
attachment
of
was
Cohen,
very
right?
profound to books, to these books.
Right. But he also had I believe, an imprint called Ex Libris,
Yes. Yes.
where he took older classics that were not available and reprinted them. He really did very well. I mean, as a book publisher, he was a great collector, right? And he liked incunabula. He liked manuscripts as much as one can find. You can't find any real manuscripts. I don't think he could afford the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't think he could buy them.
Okay.
But he did trade a lot of manuscript work with people around the world. He became deeply involved in Talmudic study at the seminary.
Right.
And I think, I would say he was an agadic Jew. If he wasn't halachic, he was agadic.
Right.
And I too am agadic more than halachic in a way, right? Because I see that the agadah, which is the flip side of the halacha, right? You have to have both, the flip side of the same coin, is freeing up the imagination.
Right.
So I've been inspired by agadah, by the capacity of these rabbis to make stuff up. I was giving a midrash class and they were talking about midrashim of what was going on in Egypt. And one person unfamiliar with it said, "How do they know that?" I said, "They don't. They made it up." He said, "What do you mean they made it up?" He says, "Well, they were imaginative people who wanted to prove a point, so they create a story and give it a setting, like all writers do, and they hope that their point gets made." And then you move on to the next guy who says, "Well, you think that's a story. I got a story for you." And that's like a lot of the associative work in the Talmud is that way. One person telling something, another one says, I heard this, and another one says, "I heard this. I heard it from my teacher, heard it from his teacher," etc., etc.
So I have to run off, but if you have another class.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
I've learned a ton. And if you have another class that follows up on that amazing story, I'm there. Okay.
Hey, maybe
So,
we'll have a
thank you.
special class on that story, right?
Perfect.
Right.
I
Okay,
would love
good.
it. Thank
Be
you.
well. Be well. Thank you. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet? Diane Bolzer, you're unmuted. Go for it.
Yes. I can't tell how relevant this is, but I'll throw it out because it went through my mind. In what we're studying, we haven't studied secular humanist Jews. And I was...
Correct.
Not yet. And it's not a criticism. I mean, I like the path we've taken in this course, but people in their struggles, like Cohen, it was either you were outside the religion or you went back somewhere towards it or you got it for yourself. Do you see a trend where people did go to humanist or secular Judaism?
Very small group. It was a breakaway from Reform movement. There was a rabbi named Sherman Wine, W-I-N-E, in Birmingham, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit.
Yeah, I
was the first humanist shul, right?
Yeah,
and it was basically at that time, it was an early period of time where he wanted to deal with intermarried couples. Mm-hmm. And create a space for them. Later, the movement, it's around. We have one in Boston, etc. It's not a flourishing movement because the Reform movement opened itself to intermarried couples who felt more comfortable. So, at Harvard today, there's a humanist chaplain.
Right.
Yeah. A Jew, of course. It has to be a Jew, of course. But he's a humanist chaplain. Look, the closest we have, I would say, in our thinkers, who I think is rightly called a humanist, a Hebrew humanist would be Martin Buber.
Yes.
Martin Buber truly, I would say, was a humanistic Jew without having to have the label, but I would say he's the closest to really understanding himself and the way human beings interact. I'll give you a little story about humanistic Jews. They actually invited me a number of years ago to give a lecture series. And, they spent a lot of time at humanistic congregations talking about God or why they don't believe in God. You spent a lot of time. You spent a lot of time talking about why you
I
don't believe in
met
God.
them for the first time because I was asked to talk when I was the director of Prophetic.
Right.
Everyone, the first thing they said to me is, "We don't believe in God, but," and I didn't even
Right.
ask them whether they believed in God.
Of course, it's like it was like the top topic.
Right.
So I responded by saying, let's leave God out of this and let's talk about the product of Jewish humans that has been created, that has lasted, that has been proven by time. Shabbos, they're all created by human beings. It's not, God may have said something in Genesis, but we as a people formed it. We created it. And a lot of what you think is, because nothing came down, they think everything came down solidly from Sinai, all figured out. I said, no, it took 1,000 years, 2,000 years. We figured it out. Humans were always in the equation, but they got upset by that. And they started moving services to Sundays. That was another thing. So I thought it was really, it meant to fit in more with what was going on in the suburbs in the 50s and 60s. But you're right, it's worth the grabbing, except I haven't seen any flourishing of it in the last 30, 40 years.
It's very interesting because it seemed to me the issue should be about God. I mean, that should be the critical difference.
Well, as I say, as I said earlier, I think it was a sociological phenomenon, right? Secularization, which was going on all through the 50s and 60s, the secularization of Jewish ideas. And as I say, I don't know if anyone's really written seriously about it, to be honest. There must be. But I wonder if someone's taken a short history of humanistic Judaism. I don't know.
I'll just say one thing, other people want to talk, but one could look at it as a reaction to the Shoah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Say it again, please. I'm sorry.
That one could look at it as a reaction to the Holocaust.
It's so funny because I think humans failed. I wouldn't depend on humans or being humanistic. For me, humans failed in the Holocaust. The last thing I want to do is depend on human beings. But okay, that's me. That's me.
Yeah, we're different on that, but that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a while back. The question is not where was God, is where were human beings?
Yes.
Where were human beings? That's a really tough question because the people who committed all of this stuff were human beings. They weren't. Someone had a hand up. Gary, you want to say something? Yeah, unmute.
Yeah, it's deeply tangential. But about a year ago, I performed a wedding ceremony in California, and I had the choice of becoming sort of a justice of the peace for a day in California, but the law, the rules, the regulations said that I couldn't mention God in the service. Zero, zip, not a word. And so
that was the regulations of the state of California.
Of the state of California. If you're a justice of the peace, it has to be a brutally civil ceremony, no religious references whatsoever, which wasn't going to work for me or the bride and groom. And so I was ordained for $40 online by the Church of Spiritual Humanism because it had no church ethos that was disturbing to my Jewish self. And by the way, if I had paid them an extra $15 fee, I could have got the title rabbi on my card, just for what it's worth. So.
It's the cheapest rabbinical school I ever heard of. That's amazing. That's really great, $15. No, a lot of people become Universalist Life Church. You know that one? You see it in the New York Times all the time, Universal Life Church.
It had too much religious kishkis for me.
Yeah.
I didn't like it.
And that's fascinating. That's really fascinating that the state law would somehow, I always thought there was freedom of speech. I'm sorry. I guess that's a separate issue there.
Not if you want to be licensed to perform.
How are they going to know what you're going to say? Jack, how are they going to know what he wants to say as a lawyer? He can sue them, right? Anyone else? Please. Yes. Anyone hasn't spoken? Anybody? Okay, Jill, unmute.
Okay. I was very interested in this idea of the absolute evil nature of the Holocaust, and what I was wondering about is his own feelings about Germany and about forgiveness, or how he felt about it, how we go on. And then I started to think about, well, in 50 years, will everything be so normalized that we might feel like we were there, but will we understand this particular culture that did this to us? Or
It's not important.
that wasn't
Nothing to
important.
do with Germany anymore. It's nothing to do with Germany anymore.
It has to do with
now
the
it's the
capacity
kids,
of-
the grandkids, and all the Jews who buy Mercedes. No problem. That's not a problem. The issue is Auschwitz has become. It's like Mitzrayim, right? What was Mitzrayim?
Yeah.
Was it really Egypt? Does it matter if it was Egypt? But slavery is slavery.
Right.
Freedom is freedom.
Right.
Evil is evil, and we have to face it. Not just say. And forgiveness is not a very big Jewish thing, to be honest. I remember coming back from a trip to Auschwitz with Rabbi Shiel. It was an ADL trip years ago with Lenny Zakim, many years ago, 1988, I think it was. Hard to believe a young man like myself was even more than a teenager then. But I was older, and we were invited by Cardinal Law to come to his mansion, which at that time was up above Boston College, right? And he said, well, we went to Auschwitz, and isn't it time to forgive? And people said, we're not in the forgiveness business. Only the person who's been transgressed against can forgive. And he said, well, it's time. I said, no, there'll never be a time to forgive, because I can't forgive what happened to somebody else. And I can't forget. I know it sounds harsh, but I can't forgive, and there's no reason to forgive. I think, on the contrary, I think Cohen is right. We have to put it into a place where we're not forgiving. But that's not where we're up to. We're facing the challenge of utter evil. It exists. Utter evil exists. We can talk about, we can be kumbaya as much as we want. There is evil. And and if it's not restrained in some way, evil will try to prevail. If that's shocking to any of you, I'm sorry. But it is the reality that we have faced. The world has faced, not only Jews. There's utter evil. And that cannot be forgiven, and it cannot be forgotten. Anyone else? I saw a hand up before. And Marilyn, and then Lily.
I was just going to mention, back to the humanistic thing. There was a very active humanistic congregation here in Boston for many years. It still might exist. Kahil Brera.
Kahal Brera, right.
Yeah.
Kahal Brera means community of choosing or of choice. Right.
Right. And I know some people from the South Shore that moved into town and specifically thoughtfully chose to go to that congregation because they were very much into the traditional celebratory Jewish life cycle, holiday stuff, but totally not religious. And they had belonged to a Reform synagogue out here first, and that was too religious. Okay. So there is a bit, there's a difference, because I mean, there's a siddur in the Reform synagogue that obviously mentions God on every page practically. These people, it's wonderful for them because they get to stay very attached to Judaism, and that's their expression of it. I think it's wonderful.
There are many. I didn't say it wasn't wonderful. I'm just saying I didn't say it wasn't wonderful. I'm just saying that it has not spread, because we have many people in the Boston community and elsewhere who send their kids to the workers' circle. That was called the workers' circle because it is secular, but they observe. I mean, they celebrate the Jewish calendar. They're totally secular. And then you have other groups that attracted Jews for many years. They still do. ethical culture, and
that was founded by a
universalist,
former rabbi.
universalist Unitarian.
Yeah,
And some of the Unitarian churches are not Christian at
Right.
all.
Yeah.
So they celebrate all the different cultures.
Right.
Yes, you'll find Jews all over the place, and you'll find many who are totally unattached.
many. Most.
It's still the
Yeah.
majority. We should have, yes, it's still the majority.
But ethical culture was founded by a rabbi as well.
Reform rabbi, right? Felix
Adler.
Adler. Felix Adler, right? And it was it was a trend of that time, and
Big in New York.
it worked for a long time. And they started an ethical culture school. It became a well-known school, a prep school in a way, etc. I don't know if it's still going on as strongly as it did. It is still there, the ethical culture school.
Two
They have
of
a
them,
beautiful
high
spot,
schools in
Central
Riverdale.
Park West. Right, they're in Central Park West.
That's
Right.
the
Yeah,
lower
very
school.
nice.
Yeah. Mhm.
You know, location.
No.
Anyone else? Yeah, Lily and then Diane.
Yeah, I just wanted to we were talking about boycotting Germany. My mother, may she rest in peace, used to always talk about that. You can never buy a German product, never. But the other thing, though, is that she would talk about, and it really is something, is the role of American Jews during that time, during when knowledge was available. What role did everybody else? Evil is evil, but there was a role here. And so, I mean, it's nothing.
This is still being debated.
It will be debated for a long time.
As recently as 3 weeks ago, I was reading an article about it based on a book by a man called Raphael Medoff, Medoff. If you want to read about it, he just published the book about what could have been done, who did, etc. Was Stephen Wise being too collegial with Roosevelt and not challenging him? And the debate goes on and on and on, and it's very hard to be simple about it and say, well, Roosevelt was an anti-Semite.
I'm not saying that. I think the role, Jews at that time in that period, there was a lot of anti-Semitism here. So I think that there was a feeling of insecurity.
Yeah, I agree.
Security to really be that vocal, and there was not security here.
Well, all I'm saying is, that's a debate that goes on. There were certain groups that had more effect. The Bergson group, Peter Bergson, which was a name for Hillel Cook, and he became an Irgun. He was an Irgun guy. The Irgun, the Jabotinsky fellow, and he organized people in the United States. He had some effect. Morgenthau, who was a treasurer, I believe, Secretary of Treasury, did start the War Refugee Board in 44, but 44 is already a bit too spät, you know what I mean? It was a little too late.
My family was gone by then, yeah.
No, right, 44 was a little late, right. No, it's an ongoing debate, but as for the German products, what changed me entirely about it was living in Israel, when every taxi I was in was a Mercedes, every good product you could buy was a German product, and I know it was part of the reparation stuff and all that, but that was never a highlight of my experience. Diane.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, thank you. For me, the issue is also responsibility and who's responsible. Individual. What does it mean for an individual to take responsibility? It's one thing to point the finger. It's another thing to look back in history. We were denied a lot of the history. I grew up that FDR was a saint. I knew nothing about the St. Louis. I knew nothing about our bad immigration.
Right. I didn't hear anything. Right. I lived in the back. In the back. No one told.
Right. Total denial. This guy was a saint. And so there's a distortion of history all over the place about many issues, and coming to the truth for accuracy, I think, is tremendously important. And then how do you face that? And what I would say is that question is the big question today. How do we look at the Trump administration? How do we look at people who are supportive of things that I find to be, quote, evil? How do we think of them? Because the people in Germany I didn't know, but some of these people I could know. What does it mean for me to think I should take responsibility for other things that maybe I didn't commit, but I was part of a country that committed? It's going on today.
That's why I'm glad.
Other statues Margaret Sanger, who's taken off a list because she sympathized with eugenics, and yet she, did a lot of good things. So these issues are deeply complicated issues. We have a particular framework when we're discussing the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
But
right, absolutely, and that's why I'm glad there are people in the streets, and I think it's going to backfire this, total fascism that we're seeing. It's going to backfire. I think even some Republicans do believe in freedom of speech. Few, I saw them, 3 of them. I talked to 3 of them, but they do believe in it. But back to what I think Cohen was saying. He was saying that we have to he was saying that we have to stand up, and we repeat that term again: break into destiny. Not what leave the natural, which we are situated in, right? We're all situated in a natural state, right? However, as Jews, he says we can break into destiny by, and I think, Diane, you worked this on your whole life, right? Is that we aim towards redemption.
Yeah.
We aim towards a goal where it will be a better world. Now, this is a mishigas to believe that human beings have the capacity to be transcendent. Yeah. Except, you hear stories about all the time, the woman who lifts the car off of her child.
Yeah.
And she said, I didn't know I had the capacity of doing that. Well, there was a transcendent moment there. She went against nature.
Yeah.
Right, whatever it is. So that's what he's basically saying. He's basically, we have to, now if you want to read, by the way, Lily, Deborah Lipstadt's first book, which was her PhD, was about the coverage given to the Shoah in the American press. Mm-hmm. Okay, I forgot the title, but the book of Deborah Lipstadt. Yeah, that was her dissertation when I was a colleague of hers at Brandeis. And she went through all of the New York Times and all major press between 1940 and 45 to see how these things were described. What page were they on? That's another thing. I'm still, if I can bring it back to the present, I'm still appalled that this use of federal forces is not the first headline of every newscast. For me, it's, I know COVID's a big problem, but to tell you the truth, this is a bigger problem. COVID didn't, COVID will get through it, but I don't know if we can get through a kind of fascist approach to freedom of speech. I think that's something we have to really fight. It's really very important. Anybody who hasn't spoken? Okay, Ken, and then Jill. And then we'll start.
So, Moshe, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I wanted to go back to your statement that that you made to Cardinal Law. I don't have to forgive anybody. It didn't happen to me. I wasn't wronged, but that's kind of a slide, right? I mean, it was done to the Jewish people. It was done to maybe some of your ancestors, certainly. So I think the real question for me is, are there some evils and some people that commit those evils that you can't forgive? And I always have a problem with the people who say, well, we're all created in God's image, and so everyone has some spark of godliness in them, and you always, you have to even treat them with love.
That's a very Christian message, right? That's a very Christian message.
Yeah, but I could not treat Eichmann, I could not treat Hitler, I could not treat Dylan Roof with that kind of love. I couldn't treat the guy that shot up the synagogue in Pittsburgh. I would not forgive him. He didn't kill anybody I knew, but he killed, and he killed for a terrible motive. It was, it's absolute evil. So why should I mean, I suppose I'm not exhibiting some basic human value because I can't forgive him, but why should I forgive? Why should I forgive an absolute evil?
I agree. We both agree. From a Jewish, for Christians, forgiveness is the ganze Geschichte. It's the whole story.
Yeah.
Jesus forgives you because you are innately a sinner. Innately, from the very beginning of your existence. And the only way you can be forgiven is if you accept Jesus. And we don't think that that's really the way the ball game works. And of course, forgiving cardinal law wanted to say, oh, we convinced these Jews to, to forgive us. I'll sleep better tonight. I don't want you to sleep. If this is on your conscience that the church didn't do what it should have done, don't sleep better tonight. That's okay. Toss and turn a little bit. It's all right. And then cardinal law, forget about it. He really, we have different stories about him.
Oh, yeah.
Jill, I think, and then someone else. Yes, Jill.
Okay, I just wanted to point out the difference in the perception of the Holocaust between Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil and Mr. Cohen.
Yes.
And I think that the contrast between the two is worth pointing out.
Right. Thank you. You're right. She saw people as cogs in machines, and that in a sense they were culpable, but not really culpable, etc. Which I found problematic because, ultimately the way that machine worked, it needed everybody to sort of participate. It doesn't happen.
This is very timely because they just sentenced a 95-year-old man to suspended sentence in Germany because he was the one that collected the valuables from the inmates at a concentration camp.
Right.
And another man who was a guard, but he was 17 years old, and he never shot anybody, but he was the guard. He kept people from escaping.
Right.
So this whole idea of people as cogs in the wheel and their responsibility it's a very interesting question, but
it's complicated. It's complicated. There's no question.
Right.
It's complicated. In our tradition, there are three things that you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed for rather than transgress. Three things. One is someone tells you to kill somebody else. Why you consider your blood, redder than the other one? That's the first one. Second is idolatry, however you understand it. If someone publicly asks you to betray your religion and bow to idols, you're supposed to allow yourself to be killed. And the third is incest or some terrible transgression of sexual morality. You should allow yourself to be killed. And then they mitigate that, does that mean only in public, etc., if someone threatens you in a private way. But whatever it is, think of those three things, okay? But I should take somebody else's life and think that my life is worth more, right? That I should renounce who I am and my core identity. Or third, be involved in something that is reprehensible from a moral point of view, which, So, and unfortunately, Jews have died for all those three things. They have not gone ahead. And there are others who did go ahead. So I'm not judging anybody. I'm saying, I don't know, I'm just saying that the tradition understands that there are certain basic things that you should allow yourself to be martyred for and not do them. And the most important one is if someone says, kill somebody else. Now, I've never been in the existential situation where the guy puts a gun to my head and says, kill that person. I don't know. I know what I know theoretically, and I hope deep down maybe I would say, okay, better me than better me to be and then not become a person who kills. But I'm not signing anything to that, okay? Not signing it. Okay, anybody? Diane Abrams, you want to say something? No. I see your hand reaching for something. No. Okay, so I'm working on now, as I say, technologically, how to bring some 4 funny films to us, a Tuesday night film festival. I'll try to figure out, I think it's possible to do. We're going to work on it tonight a little bit just to practice with some stuff. And then I will hopefully go back to some other teaching in the fall. And by then we'll have a little bit of a better picture of how we're preparing for the High Holy Days. And that's going to be a challenge, of course. So, but I was very pleased to be able to lead services Friday night. It was very moving to me. I had not done it for many, many months. And I hope to be doing that as well, hopefully on a more regular basis. And I was glad we had so many of you were there. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity to meet on this weekly time period. It's very enriching to me and giving me a lot to do during the week. I read a lot. Reading a lot. So it keeps me on my toes. Yeah.
Friday night was great.
Yeah,
Ramona.
Friday
Thank
night.
you. Yes, it was
It
wonderful.
was awesome.
People are going in person?
You have a future. I think you have a future. That
Yes.
was good.
People are attending in person?
People are what in person?
Attending?
No.
Going to
No.
service?
No,
okay.
Zoom. I did a Zoom service. It's my first time doing one, but I thought I did okay. I don't know. I didn't fall down or trip or
It was really
throw
good.
up. I didn't throw up, but it was good.
Come on.
So Tyler is staying online with me, and all of the others are saying goodbye. And I say goodbye to all of you.
Great class, Red Moshe.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here.
Young
All the
Valley,
best.
Thank you.
nice job.
Thank
Very
you.
well.
Love you,
Take
Mo.
care.
Nice
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Ramona.
friends.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Hi, Tyler. So we want to play a little bit today on this? See how it works?
Yep.
Yeah?
We can also,
Okay.
let's, why don't you end the meeting and re-enter so it's not recording?
I'll end the meeting and re-enter, okay?